Now, as you know, I have distinguished visitors with me here in the studio. But before I ask their opinions, I want to offer one more comparison between the reproducing piano and a gramophone record. The reproducing piano is pretending to be Rachmaninoff playing Mendelssohn's Bee's Wedding. And remember that Rachmaninoff himself allowed these roles to be sold as completely authentic. Fortunately, any eccentricities in interpretation are easily noticeable, and they are equally noticeable in a gramophone record. Once again, I make the point that the gramophone record could have been made years afterwards, so the degree of accent or delay may not be exactly the same. But the style, the way Rachmaninoff thought about Mendelssohn, I think is the same. Did you notice the similar features, the way Rachmaninoff disobeys Mendelssohn both times and invents accents and delays that aren't in the score? Now, a great many people today are too young to have heard performances by Rachmaninoff or Levin or any other pianist of the period, and millions of musical people have never even set eyes on an ordinary sort of pianola, much less one of the rare and expensive reproducing pianos. But I have with me in the studio today Mr. Frank Merrick, who has a long and vivid memory. As a youth, he studied for a long time with the great Leschetizky in Vienna, who taught so many of the greatest pianists of that era. He is himself a famous pianist, a teacher and expert. So, Frank Merrick, what's your first comment on all this?
That the reproductions are extraordinarily faithful and of considerable historic importance.
You just accept them as completely valid?
I accept them, yes, and the similarity which you explained is very apparent indeed. I totally agree with you.
No. Well, now, thank you, Frank Merrick, and now I turn to Lionel Salter. Mr. Salter is a distinguished pianist and harpsichordist, and what's particularly relevant to this discussion, he is the person who on so many occasions has decided who shall win the competition, who shall broadcast, who shall record, and in recent years, as head of music department BBC Television, who shall play in front of the cameras. Now, Lionel Salter, you are, so to speak, a buyer of performances. Could I sell you one of these as authentic?
I think you could sell me the Levine without any difficulty at all. I don't see any difference between the recording he made for the gramophone and that for the piano. Over the Rachmaninoff, although the style of performance is so very similar with that hiccup, which I think very distasteful, I must say, personally, in the Mendelssohn features in both performances, there's something about the first recording on the piano which strikes me as being, I don't know, somehow untrue to life. Was it simply that it was just on the verge of being too fast for the human fingers? Was it just that the sound of some of the inner parts verged on the intangible almost? There's something which didn't quite convince me about that, and yet when you played it on the recording from the gramophone, although it was obviously the same person playing it, I was much more convinced.
Over the question of the speed being too fast for human fingers, have you ever tried playing the piano at the same time as Rachmaninoff record is playing and trying to keep up with it?
No, I never have.
Well, it often seems to me that he always played at a speed impossible for human fingers.
I thought that his execution in the gramophone record was slightly inferior in minute details to that on the other. that the alto voices and tenor voices seem to me a little bit more sketchy. That was my impression.
Yes, well, it was possible in some small degree to correct small imperfections on these piano rolls in consultation with the artist, so that there would be perhaps a greater degree of perfection, just as nowadays, when people record on tape. If they don't like the performance, they retape, or they retape a section of it. So we have a sort of unnatural perfection today, whereas in the old days of recording, you just played your piece and that was it. No, what interests me is that some of the old piano rolls include some very peculiar and erratic passages. It is these that make the whole thing so authentic, because evidently that's how the artist wanted the music to go. For example, let's turn to Paderewski, playing Chopin's Polonaise in A-flat. And let's remember that as far as popular acclaim went, say about the year 1905, he was the greatest pianist in the world. Here it is. Now let me turn to Frank Merrick. Does that sound to you like Paderewski as he was 50 years ago?
Well, my first confession is that I heard him play that very piece in the Colston Hall, Bristol, in 1898, but I had never heard it before, which makes rather a difference. Paderewski, on occasions when I've heard him in concerts, was as variable as anybody who ever was, and sometimes on the same occasion he would play part of the time abominably and part of the time superbly. Of course, in this, none of it is abominable in the sense of crashing wrong notes by the dozen, which sometimes occurred. The eccentricities of rhythm are certainly very disappointing to our critical judgment. I should think that that is how he played it on that occasion. The first time I met Fanny Davis, she had just come from a Paderewski recital, and she said the programme was, a lot of it was terrible, and when he came to the encores, he suddenly became an angel, and it was quite lovely.
Now, do you recognise this as his style? I mean, let's put it this way, if I had this thing played to you without mentioning who the artist was and said, now, guess who that was, would you say, oh, that must surely be Paderewski?
I don't know whether I would go as far as that, but a good many of the peculiarities, the rhythmical and playing one hand before the other, a lot of those things certainly did occur in his playing.
Anyway, I take it that you don't agree with the popular verdict of that era that he was the greatest pianist ever.
Oh, Lord, no.
And I think, Mr. Salter, you would take the same opinion, would you?
No, I think this is a romantic impression in any case. But surely that one has to remember that fashions in playing have changed all the time. And if we could hear Chopin himself play, I wonder how it would consort with the kind of playing of Chopin we get today.